The United States was born into debt. The Revolutionary War had cost the Continental Congress enormous sums borrowed from France, the Netherlands, and domestic creditors, and the new nation's financial credibility was, to put it generously, uncertain. The solution to this crisis of public finance would simultaneously create the conditions for an American securities market. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton, serving as the first Secretary of the Treasury, presented his famous report on public credit to Congress, proposing that the federal government assume all state debts from the Revolution and fund them through the issuance of new government bonds. Congress accepted. At a stroke, Hamilton created a large standardized body of government securities that needed to be bought, sold, and valued, and he did so deliberately. Hamilton understood that a liquid, trustworthy market for public debt was the foundation of national creditworthiness, and that creditworthiness was the foundation of national power. The Bank of the United States, also Hamilton's creation, was chartered in 1791, and its shares were offered to the public. Together with the new government bonds and shares of a handful of insurance companies, these instruments constituted the first American securities market. Trading initially happened informally in the coffee houses and on the street corners of Philadelphia, which was then the nation's capital and its financial center. The volume was modest, the participants relatively few, and the mechanisms improvised. In 1653, a wall was built in what is today known as Lower Manhattan, or the Financial District, to marginalize Native Americans. That area would later be named Wall Street. With the aggressive increase in the slave trade, an official slave market opened in Manhattan in 1711 by the East River on Wall Street between Pearl and Water Streets. By 1730, 42% of the population owned slaves, a higher percentage than in any other city in the country except Charleston, South Carolina. The enslaved population, which ranged between 15 and 20% of the total, literally built the city and was the engine that made its economy run. The slave market on Wall Street closed in 1762. On May 17, 1792 in New York, in competition with Philadelphia, 24 brokers and merchants gathered beneath a buttonwood tree on Wall Street and signed what became known as the Buttonwood Agreement. The document was brief, barely 2 sentences, but its meaning was substantial. The signatories agreed to trade securities among themselves at fixed commission rates and to give preference to one another in their dealings. It was, in essence, a cartel agreement, but it was also the founding charter of what would become the New York Stock Exchange. The group initially met outdoors and then at the Tontine Coffee House, formalizing their organization gradually over the following decades. In 1817, the organization reconstituted itself as the New York Stock and Exchange Board, adopting a formal constitution, a president, and fixed trading hours. Membership was now limited and required a fee. The market had acquired institutional permanence. For its first several decades, the New York market was primarily a market in government debt and bank stocks. The securities of the new republic were the dominant instruments, and the volume of trading, by later standards, was tiny. What transformed the American securities market from a small-scale institutional arrangement into the engine of a continental economy was the railroad. The railroad boom of the 1830s and 1840s introduced a new kind of financial demand to American capital markets. Railroads required capital investment on a scale that dwarfed anything previously attempted in American private enterprise. Thousands of miles of track, locomotives, rolling stock, bridges, stations, and labor, all to be assembled before a single dollar of revenue could be earned. No individual, no bank, no partnership could finance a trunk railroad alone. The Joint Stock Corporation, financed through the public sale of both shares and bonds, was the only vehicle adequate to the task. Between the 1830s and the Civil War, railroad securities came to dominate the New York market entirely. The NYSE grew in volume, in membership, and in sophistication to accommodate this demand, developing new practices in underwriting, in bond trading, and in the management of large-scale corporate information. The Civil War fundamentally restructured American finance. The Union government's need to fund an industrial-scale war produced an explosion of federal debt, a national banking system, and the legal tender acts that created paper money, greenbacks, for the first time. Jay Cooke, the Philadelphia banker who managed the sale of Union war bonds to ordinary American citizens through a vast network of agents and newspapers, essentially invented mass retail investment in the process. The war also accelerated the development of futures and commodity markets in Chicago, where the Chicago Board of Trade, founded in 1848, became the center of grain trading for the expanding Midwest. American finance was becoming both national in scale and plural in its institutional geography. The Federal Reserve System was barely a year old when the First World War transformed the global financial order. The war destroyed European capital markets, ended the gold standard as a practical mechanism, and converted the United States from the world's largest debtor nation to its largest creditor virtually overnight. Wall Street emerged from the war as the new center of global finance, and New York displaced London as the world's leading financial city. The 1920s that followed were, for the American securities markets, a decade of intoxicating expansion that ended in the most catastrophic financial collapse in the history of capitalism. Several forces converged to create the bull market of the 1920s. The American economy was genuinely productive and dynamic, generating real growth in industrial output, consumer purchasing power, and corporate profits. New industries, automobiles, radio, aviation, electrical appliances, captured the public imagination and provided the narrative of transformation that speculative markets require. New financial instruments, particularly the investment trust, a forerunner of the modern mutual fund, allowed investment banks to pool small investors' money and direct it into the market, dramatically broadening the investor base. Most significantly, the practice of buying on margin, purchasing stocks with borrowed money, typically requiring only 10% in cash, allowed investors to control far larger positions than their actual capital warranted, multiplying both potential gains and potential losses. Stock market investment, which had historically been the province of the wealthy and the institutional, became in the 1920s a mass phenomenon. Barbers, taxi drivers, secretaries, and shopkeepers were buying stocks on margin, and the financial press treated every upward movement as confirmation of a permanent new era of prosperity. The end, when it came, was swift and total. In September 1929, the market began to weaken. On October 24th, Black Thursday, panic selling produced enormous volume and a sharp decline, temporarily arrested by a pool of leading bankers who placed large visible purchase orders to restore confidence, a tactic borrowed from the Morgan Playbook of 1907. The respite lasted 5 days. On October 28th and 29th, Black Monday and Black Tuesday, the market collapsed in a selling cascade that destroyed more value in 2 days than existed in most of the world's national economies. The ticker tape fell hours behind the actual trading, meaning that investors were selling into prices they could not know, often below what they had already paid. Fortunes accumulated over decades evaporated in hours. What followed was not merely a market crash, but an economic catastrophe of civilization-altering scale. The mechanisms of transmission from financial collapse to Great Depression have been analyzed extensively by economists from Irving Fisher to Milton Friedman to Ben Bernanke, who famously summarized the Federal Reserve's failure with an apology on Friedman's behalf. The banking system, heavily exposed to collapsed asset values, and the margin loans of the bull market, began to fail in waves. The Federal Reserve, misunderstanding its own mandate, contracted the money supply precisely when expansion was required. Between 1929 and 1933, roughly a third of all American banks failed. The money supply contracted by 1/3, industrial output fell by nearly half, and unemployment rose to approximately 25%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had peaked at 381 in September 1929, reached its trough in July 1932 at 41, a decline of almost 90% from the peak. It would not return to its 1929 high until 1954. The New Deal, response to the Great Crash, fundamentally remade the institutional framework of American finance. Franklin Roosevelt's administration, confronting a financial system in complete collapse, understood that the restoration of public confidence required not merely emergency liquidity, but structural reform, a new set of rules that would prevent the conditions of the 1920s from reconstituting themselves. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 was the first and most dramatic instrument of this redesign, drafted in response to the Pecora hearings, a Senate investigation that had exposed the full range of the 1920s financial abuses, including the sale of worthless securities to customers by banks that were simultaneously underwriting them. Glass-Steagall erected a wall between commercial banking and investment banking. Banks that accepted federally insured deposits could no longer underwrite or trade in corporate securities. The separation was intended to prevent the conflicts of interest that had allowed banks to use depositors' money to sustain speculative markets in which they had proprietary interests. The same legislation created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guaranteed bank deposits up to a fixed amount and, in doing so, eliminated the primary mechanism of bank runs. The first mover advantage that made rational depositors rush to withdraw before their neighbors could. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 created the modern framework of securities regulation. For the first time, companies seeking to sell securities to the public were required to disclose material financial information through a formal registration process. The 1934 Act created the Securities and Exchange Commission to administer and enforce these requirements, with Joseph Kennedy, himself a veteran of the 1920s markets, as its first chairman. The creation of the SEC established the principle that markets function best not when the government manages them, but when it ensures that all participants have access to the same truthful information, a concept known as disclosure regulation. These New Deal reforms, radical at the time, proved durable. With significant modifications, they remain the foundation of American securities regulation today. The Second World War, which mobilized American industrial capacity on an unprecedented scale, also drew millions of ordinary Americans back into financial participation through the purchase of war bonds. The great bond drives of 1942 through 1945 were the most successful mass retail securities offerings in American history, reaching tens of millions of households and reestablishing a culture of investment that the Depression had nearly extinguished.